Hello there, and welcome to this video on the Daystate Air Ranger. In our previous video, we took a fully functioning and complete rifle and broke it down into individual components. In this video, we're going to be taking those individual components and rebuilding them into a complete rifle. As we walk through the process, I will also be giving you some service tips and just some general information on the rifle. Before we get started, on your screen now will be a complete list of all the tools that I'm going to use in order to carry out this reassembly process. It includes all of the Allen key sizes, all of the spanner sizes, and finally any Daystate specific tooling required to complete the job. And the last thing I want to mention before we get started is that this particular rifle is a Daystate Air Ranger in .22 caliber, and the rifle is in the sub 12 pound power level. With that being said, the information in this video will also be relevant to the other calibers and other power levels. With that all said and done, we can begin on the reassembly process, and to start off with, we're going to be reattaching the valve housing to the main block. To begin with, we're going to be taking our valve stem seal, adding a little bit of silicone grease to this O-ring here. And I will mention while I'm greasing the O-ring that if you require any O-rings for your Air Ranger, a full and complete kit can be found on the Daystate store. With that said, we can drop the O-ring into the seat there and then get it seated with an Allen key or something similar. With that done, we can then take our cap, this piece here, and get that screwed in using a flat-bladed screwdriver. With that done, we can add the valve housing to the main block, nice and simply like so. Getting it pushed in all the way, then we can start adding the fasteners. To start off with, we're going to be adding these two countersunk screws here, one to either side. To start off with, what I've gone ahead and done is tightened the screws up, then backed them off a quarter of a turn so that they're now loose. I'm doing this as we will need to add the pin a little later on, and if the screws are tight, sometimes the valve housing itself can be misaligned slightly. With that said, we can add this grub screw here to the hole in the bottom, getting that done up nice and tightly with a 1/8 Allen key. For now, we're going to be leaving the stock bolt piece off, as we will need to get the pin in first. So what we're going to do is just add the pin to the side here, and then I'm going to get this put in my vise, and I'm going to drive the pin through until an equal amount is sticking out from either side. So there we have it, I've got the pin driven in, and as we take a look from the top there, you can see an equal amount is sticking out from either side. We can go ahead and attach our stock bolt fitting to getting that done up by hand first, then coming through with an adjustable spanner and just getting it done up nice and tightly. The next thing we can do is tighten our Allen headed bolts, and that's done using a 3/32 Allen key. Getting those done up nice and tightly, and that's pretty much the valve housing installed onto the main block. With that done, the next thing we're going to do is get the hammer rebuilt. So to start off with, we'll take our hammer weight, this piece here, and we'll take our hammer striker, which is this piece here. If we take a look at the weight, we have this grub screw here, which needs to be aligned with the front of the hammer, and the flat face of the grub screw needs to be aligned with the front of the hammer as well. So we're going to get things screwed in just like that. We're going to be getting it screwed in by hand first, then we're coming through with a 3mm Allen key through the back of the hammer weight, then we can just wind the striker face in. For now, we're just going to be getting things a little past flush. So about there will do us. We can readjust the power when we build the rifle back up. With that done, we can take our hammer housing, this piece here, and add our weight, getting the hole aligned with this hole here. And with that done, we can then take an M4 screw, get that screwed into the side of the weight so that everything's fixed just like that. What we're going to do then is take the brass retention piece as well as the return spring, get things installed like that. Then I'm going to be adding a small amount of blue Loctite to these threads here. Then we can get that screwed into the back of the hammer weight. As I do that up, I'm just going to keep a nice firm grip of the M4 bolt. And what that does is stop the hammer weight from spinning in the hammer housing. With that all done, the last thing we can do is just add our small locking grub screw, and we're going to be getting that done up using a 2mm Allen key. With that all said and done, there's our hammer fully rebuilt. Right then, before we get the hammer installed into the rifle, I very briefly want to run through how a slingshot hammer works. So a slingshot hammer works by using a movable center weight with a fixed outer housing. So what happens is when we cock the rifle, the whole assembly moves back just like so against hammer spring pressure. Then as we fire the rifle, the whole hammer assembly flies forward and this hammer housing hits a stop within the block. At that point, the center section continues going, exposing the striking face, and then this comes into contact with the end of the valve, allowing it to open, and that releases a shot of air which pushes a pellet out the barrel. A slingshot hammer is very beneficial in terms of efficiency, as the rifle can run a relatively heavy hammer spring, a relatively light hammer, and we don't have to worry about any valve preload. Valve preload in this case would be if the hammer was always trying to force the valve open. Having a slingshot hammer reduces hammer bounce, and overall it just allows the rifle to get a load more shots with no real downsides. With that done, the next thing we're going to do is rebuild the safety assembly. To begin with, we'll take the safety body, this piece here, and just add a very light smear of lithium grease to the front face. So just a small amount will do us. We can then take this back section here, align this pin in the back with this hole over here, and put the two pieces together just like so. With that done, we can get the two pieces secured using this screw here, and before this goes in, I am just going to be adding a very small amount of blue Loctite to the screw threads. With that done, we can just get things dropped into position, then we can get the screw done up nice and tightly with a flat bladed screwdriver. As you do that up tight, just make sure that the two pieces can rotate independently of one another and that they're stopping as they should. The next thing we can do is add the ball detent, so this assembly here. And again, before that goes in, I am just going to be adding a small amount of lithium grease to both the spring and the ball bearing before they go in the hole. So just a small amount to the ball bearing first. We can drop that in that hole there. And we can do the same for the spring. And then finally we can get that topped off with this small grub screw here, getting that done up with a 1/16 Allen key. The grub screw doesn't need to be done up tight, it just needs to be flush with the housing, and that should give us a nice detent. The next thing we'll do is add the safety screw, so this piece here. All we need to do with this piece for now is get it screwed into this hole in the side here. We will have to readjust the safety position when the rifle's all built up, so I'm just going to be leaving the screw done into about there for now. Again, the sub 12 pound rifles would normally have an anti-tamper pin across the back here, and this would stop you adjusting the hammer. However, this has been removed on this particular rifle. Up next, we're going to be installing the hammer, hammer spring and safety to the main block of the rifle. Starting off, we'll be taking our hammer, this piece here, aligning the metal part with the back side of the action, and then aligning this hole in the top of the hammer with the top of the block. We can get that pushed into position, then we can secure that in place by using this screw here, getting that done in with a 3/32 Allen key. This screw here is only going into plastic, so it doesn't need to be done up mega tight, just snugged up will do. The next thing we can do is add the hammer spring to the back, along with the anti-rattle guide, and then we can get that topped off with the safety assembly. What we are going to have to do is push the hammer spring in whilst aligning the safety. So we have one hole on this side, one hole on this side, and then two holes in the top of the safety, and they need to be aligned with their respective holes. Once we've got it pushed in, we can just hold it in place, then add our two securing grub screws. As you do the two grub screws up, just make sure the two holes in the top of the safety line up with the two holes in the block. But there we have it. The next thing we'll do is install our trigger. So to begin with, I've gone ahead and laid the trigger components out in their rough location so that you get an idea of the orientation that they're supposed to be installed in. The other thing I'll mention is that I have gone ahead and put a little bit of grease over the sides of the sears, just so they slip and slide nicely in the assembly. The first sear we're going to be installing is this one here, and this one here needs to be aligned with this hole in the action block. What I like to do is take the pin, install it from the back side, then put a small amount of pressure on it with one of my fingers. We can then come through from this side and get the hole in the side of the sear aligned with the hole in the block. Once we have it in rough position, we can go ahead and push the pin through, making sure the sear is where it's supposed to be. With the first one in, the next one we can install is this one here, and this hole here needs to be aligned with this hole in the side of the trigger assembly. Again, we're just going to get it dropped in first. And then we can come through with our pin, install it from this side, and then manipulate the sear into its final position. The last piece of the puzzle is the trigger blade, this piece here, and this hole at the top here needs to be aligned with this hole here. With all the pieces in there, we can go ahead and test the trigger is working correctly by taking something like an Allen key, pushing the hammer back, cocking the piece, and then firing it. So our trigger's working exactly as it should. We can go ahead and add the spacer piece, which is just this piece here, and this piece needs to be aligned with this final hole in the front here. To install that, I'm just going to install it using a set of needle nose pliers. Then we can get it installed using this screw here. Getting that done up nice and tightly with a 3/32 Allen key. The last piece we can add is the trigger guard to the bottom here. Like I said in the disassembly video, my rifle is slightly different in that it used to be used as a laser training rifle, so I only have one securing point for the trigger guard, although there would normally be two, one at the front, one at the back. But not to worry, we can add the small nuts, so this nut here, to this slot in the bottom. We can then take our trigger guard, drop that over, and then install our small screw. Getting that done up with a flat bladed screwdriver. As you tighten the screw, you will need to keep a hold of this nut in the base here. Then we're going to be getting the trigger guard roughly aligned. Something like that. Then we can tighten the nut into position. So there we have it. There's the trigger fully assembled. The next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is rebuild the bottle housing assembly, and to start off with, I do very briefly want to mention that I am going to be swapping out the old bottle housing for a brand new one. Again, this is recommended by the manufacturer to do so every 10 years for both the bottle housing, the bolts that hold the bottle housing onto the valve, as well as the bottle. With that all said, the first thing we're going to do is get the gauge installed into the side here. So we're going to get that screwed in by hand, then done up nice and tightly using a 22mm spanner. With that done, we can reassemble the one-way valve and the Foster fitting by first putting the one-way valve into the Foster fitting with the O-ring aligned with the top, and then lightly screwing these two pieces together. With that done, we can take the whole assembly and screw it into the bottom of the bottle housing, getting everything done up nice and tightly with a 16mm spanner. Up next, we're going to be installing a few parts onto the main block of the rifle. They include the valve, the bottle housing, and then the bottle. Now, I have two bottles laid out in front of us here. This one at the top is a 480cc carbon fibre bottle, and then this one here is the original aluminium 400cc bottle. The carbon fibre bottle is a larger capacity and is slightly larger than the original aluminium one, so for the purpose of this video I am going to be swapping it over. The bottles have the same thread in the end, so they can be interchanged freely, and as we're installing the new bottle anyway, it made sense to upgrade to the carbon fibre one. The first thing we're going to be doing is getting the valve seat installed into the main block, and before that goes in, I am just going to be adding a small amount of silicone grease to the outside O-ring. To begin with, we'll just get that dropped into the body here, and what we want is this counterboard side facing us and the flat side facing down. It can sometimes take a little bit of time to get it to drop into the housing correctly, but luckily I got it first time. We can then take our valve pin along with our valve return spring and nice and carefully fish that into position, making sure the valve is seated correctly. With that done, we can then add the bottle housing to the front. Before that goes in, we are just going to be adding a small amount of silicone grease to this external O-ring here, wiping off the excess and then getting that pushed into position. As we push it into position, we're going to be taking our new M5 bolts and getting those screwed into the face here. The next thing we can do is go ahead and get our bottle installed onto the front here, and before that goes on, I am just going to be adding a small amount of silicone grease to this O-ring on the base here. With that done, we can take our bottle and get that screwed onto the threads. The only other thing that I want to mention in regards to the bottle is that the manufacturer date is stamped on the bottle itself. So along the neck here on the aluminium bottles, you will be able to find the made date, and this is the date that we need to take into consideration when we assess the age of the rifle. The date on this particular bottle is 2009, so this rifle here was well overdue for a bottle housing and bolt replacement. However, I will say that this particular rifle has spent most of its life depressurized, so that isn't overly alarming. What I do want to mention, however, is that if you buy a brand new bottle straight from Daystate, the date on the bottle may be a few months or even a year out. This is just because of the supply chain, so when the bottles are made, it takes time to ship them and then store them. So if you buy a brand new bottle, don't be too alarmed if the date on the side of it isn't that recent. If you go ahead and install the new bottle and bottle housing, just go ahead and make a note somewhere of the date that you did the work, and then you can just take the service interval from 10 years from that point. But with that all said, we can continue on with the rebuild. The next thing we're going to do is reassemble the top block. Up next, we're going to be rebuilding the top block, and to start off with, we're going to be installing the pellet probe into the block itself. So to start off with, we're just going to be adding a small amount of moly grease to the outside of the pellet probe. If you didn't have moly grease on hand, you could also use something like plain lithium grease. So just a small amount on the outside will do. We can then wipe off the excess with our fingers, and then we can get the probe installed through the back of the action. With that done, the next thing we can do is take our cocking dog, which is just this piece here, and before this goes in, I am going to be adding a small amount of blue Loctite to these threads here, as we don't want this piece coming loose whilst the rifle is in use. So with a small amount of blue Loctite, we can get that screwed into the pellet probe, just in this hole here. Getting that done up nice and tightly with a 3/32 Allen key. Up next, we're going to be getting our barrel installed. So to begin with, we'll pull our pellet probe back. We can then take our barrel, align the transfer pull up with the bottom of the block, and then get that slid in through the front. Once we have our dimples aligned with the respective holes, we can get the securing grub screws installed. The short grub screws are aligned with the bottom of the block, and the long grub screws go in through the top. Up next, whilst we have the block turned up this way, the next thing I'm going to do is add the ball detent to the rear section here. So to begin with, we'll take our ball bearing and just add a very small amount of moly grease to the outside of it, and then get that dropped through this hole in the back of the block. We can then take our spring, again adding a small amount of moly grease to the outside of it, and drop that over the hole, getting that secured using this small grub screw here. This grub screw doesn't need to be done up tight, we just need to get it flush with the top of the block, and then check that the detent is working correctly. So I'm quite happy there, there's a nice positive detent. Then we can flip the block back over once again. The next thing we can do is get the magazine indexing plate installed, and to start off with, we're going to be installing this spring and this pin here into this hole in the rear of the block. So to start off with, we'll take our spring, add a small amount of moly grease to the outside of it, and then get that slid through the block. Doing the same with the small pin. So a small amount of moly grease on the outside of it, then pushing that through into the block. At this point, I'm going to be taking a small cotton bud and just adding a small amount of moly grease to the internal surfaces of the block. So just along the back edge here and over here. Just adding a small amount wherever the magazine indexing plate runs. We can then take our magazine indexing plate and again just add a very small amount of moly grease to the top side, the sides, and then through the middle of the piece, just in here. With that done, what we need to do is get the cutout aligned with the top of the block and the flat side aligned with the bottom, and then get that dropped over the cocking dog and push it back against spring tension. So at the moment it should hook into place just like so. The last thing we can add is the brass transfer pull and the transfer pull O-ring, this one here. Before this goes in, I am just going to be adding a small amount of silicone grease to the outside of the O-ring. We can then pull the magazine indexing plate back using the cocking arm, hold it in position, and then drop the O-ring into the hole there, getting that topped off with our small brass transfer pull piece. And there we have it. So that's the top block fully rebuilt. Up next, we're going to be getting the two halves of the rifle reattached. To begin with, we're going to be taking the second transfer pull O-ring, this one here, and just adding a small amount of silicone grease to it. And with that done, we can flip our block up and just add the O-ring to this hole here, pushing that down nicely so it's seated in the hole. With that done, we can take our top block, align it accordingly, and then get the two pieces sandwiched together. Once we have the two blocks aligned, we can then start adding the 6 securing screws. The first bolts I'm going to be adding to this rifle are the ones in the back of the block. On this particular rifle they are standard Allen headed bolts, although on the standard sub 12 pound rifles these will be replaced by triangle headed anti-tamper bolts. In the middle we can add the 2 countersunk flat headed bolts. And at the front we can again add the 2 Allen headed bolts. With all 6 bolts started, we can now go through and tighten each pair up. With the 2 halves of the rifle put back together, the next thing we're going to do is readjust the safety screw, this piece here. This screw here is designed to stop the trigger from being pulled when the rifle is on safe. As you can see here, at the moment we can pull the trigger and this amount of movement would fire the rifle. So all we're going to do is back the safety screw out until it comes into contact with the trigger itself. So about there we can no longer move the trigger with the safety in the correct position. However, it is a little difficult to switch on and off as the screw hits the trigger blade, so we're just going to go in about half a turn, then hold the screw in position and tighten the locking nut. And again that's done with a 1/4 inch spanner. With that tight, the rifle is no longer able to fire with the rifle on safe, and we can flick the safety backwards and forwards nice and easily. We can check that the safety is working by cocking the rifle, putting the rifle on safe, so it's on safe at the moment, then trying to fire the rifle. As you can see there, the trigger is hitting the safety pin and the rifle won't fire, but as soon as we flick it off safe, the rifle will now fire. The next thing we're going to go ahead and do is reassemble the shroud and then get it installed onto the rifle. So to start off with, what I've gone ahead and done is assemble the shroud components just like so. The next thing I'm going to do is just add a small amount of silicone grease to this rear O-ring here. And with that done, we can get that installed into the end of the shroud, pushing it in nice and gently. With that done, we're going to make sure the 2 grub screws at the back of the shroud are done out, so that they're a bit proud of the finish. Then we can go ahead and slide the shroud assembly over the barrel, making sure to get everything pushed into position, then making sure the gap on either side is equal, so the radius of the shroud is matching the front of the block. Then we can go ahead and tighten the 2 grub screws up. And that's done with a 5/64 Allen key. Right then, with that all said and done, the rifle is pretty much fully rebuilt and ready to be installed into the stock. Before we go ahead and do that though, there are just a few more things that I would like to mention. So on this particular rifle, we went ahead and replaced the original aluminium bottle with a brand new carbon fibre one. The carbon fibre bottle is incompatible with the barrel band, so we're going to be leaving that off this particular rifle. The next thing I want to mention is that before the action goes back into the stock, it is recommended to pressurize the rifle and then shoot it over a chronograph to make sure the power was where you wanted it to be. If you're interested in learning how to adjust the power of your rifle, we do have a full video tutorial on adjusting the power on a Daystate Huntsman. The Huntsman and the Air Ranger both share the exact same hammer setup, so the power adjustment procedure is identical between the 2 rifles. So if you're interested in adjusting the power, I would recommend watching that video. And then the other thing that I want to mention is that before the action goes back into the stock, it is recommended to leak test the rifle overnight just to make sure there's no leaks after the rebuild. The easiest way to leak test the rifle is to fill it up to a certain pressure, let's just say for example 200 bar. We would then mark the gauge at 200 bar, leave the rifle overnight, and then check the gauge once again in the morning. If the gauge has moved off the mark, that means you have a slow leak and you'll need to find it on the rifle. However, if the gauge is still on the mark, the rifle is sealed and ready to go back into the stock. To save us a little bit of time, I'm going to pretend I have done both of those things, and I'm just going to be installing the action back into the stock. So to start off with, we'll take our action, flick it on its back just like so, then we'll take our stock and get that hooked over the action. There is a little bit of a trick to get the action installed into the stock. What you have to do is angle the stock up slightly, then hook it over the back of the trigger guard, then push the front of the stock down and into position. With that done, we can get the stock bolt done up nice and tightly. And then we can add the dust cap for the filler port. Right then, with that all said and done, the rebuild is fully complete. So with that said, thank you very much for watching. I hope it has been interesting or useful, and we'll see you in the next one.